Hello and welcome to this BloombergQuint discussion. The economic survey for the year has been tabled on Tuesday, and along with laying down the state of the economy, the economic survey always throws up some interesting discussion points, things that the economy should think about, not necessarily do, but at least start talking about. This time around, apart from an assessment of the impact of demonetization, thinking on the fiscal roadmap, there is the concept of the universal basic income, which has been debated or at least been thrown out for debate, and the concept of a bad bank that has been thrown out for debate. So there's a lot to discuss while we try and assess the economic survey. I've got some of the best economists and economic minds in the country joining us here today. We've got Joshi of CRISIL. We've got Soumyakanti Ghosh of State Bank of India, Upasna Bhardwaj of Kotak Mahindra Bank, and Reetika Khera is joining us via Skype from Delhi. She is a noted economist and a specialist in the issue and the area of universal basic income. Thank you all very much for joining us. Appreciate you taking the time to come to BloombergQuint. I'm going to actually, first start with some of the headline grabbing issues that have been brought about, and then we'll talk about fiscal and growth. And the biggest issue is universal basic income. Reetika, let me turn to you right off on that because I know you've written about it. The economic survey has thrown it out for debate. There's nothing to say that this will actually be implemented from here on. But what do you make of the core of the proposal? Essentially, they're saying do away with everything else and bring in a UBI. But they've also said they have to do it in phases. It's not something that can be done dramatically in one step. So what did you make of it in its entirety first?
Right. So my initial reading of that chapter on UBI in the economic survey is that it's a slightly confused document because on the one hand, they say we can't afford a universal basic income that would in fact be true to the spirit of the idea, which is that it should be universal and it should guarantee a certain basic income. That estimate is coming in their own document in table 3, I think, to about 10 to 14% of the GDP. So they say we can't be true to the actual spirit of the thing. And then they say actually our own experience with targeting in India has been very bad. That's in box number 1. It's actually encouraging that finally the government has taken on board the abysmal disaster that targeting has been in the past 10 years or so, and acknowledges that because it was disastrous, we moved away from targeting. And then, so they're not able to then resolve this question. There is one interesting idea which unfortunately is not pursued enough, and of course it's an idea that I'm very favorable to, which is that you could think of old age pensions which are about 200 rupees, from 200 rupees onwards to up to 2000 rupees depending on which state you live in. You think of that as one form of universal basic incomes and start with that.
Okay.
That itself would actually cost 1.2% or 1.5%, 1 to 2% of GDP, okay. Which would be affordable.
Okay. Reetika, I'll come to that idea in a minute. I just want to first get initial thoughts from the others as well. Mr. Joshi, I mean, we've complained about subsidies and targeting of subsidies, poor targeting of subsidies for years and years now. They are giving you an alternative. Is it an alternative to your mind at all?
Well, I think it can be an alternative. You have to first identify the poorest of the poor. I mean, the ones whom you don't reach out to. I think that's a major challenge, identifying the right people, because it will take time for it to be universal. I think they'll have to do it in phases. But I think identification and then I think delivery. I think these are the two things which and government is hoping to leverage on technology, etc., to push the cash to the people. But I think identification is even if you look at the Aadhaar and other things, or opening of bank accounts for the poor, they have not been able to reach out to the areas which are remote, which need them the most. So I think that to me is a fundamental problem. I mean, because those are the guys who need it most.
Yeah. And if you want to jump in on this, I mean, the numbers, if you want to talk about, because they have put out some numbers that will cost about 4% of GDP.
Yeah. No, I think you are correct on hit the nail on the head. In terms of the cost, what they have pointed out is 5% of GDP. And that actually translates to around, for example, if you look into the figures, they have arrived at a weighted average of rural and urban wages, which is around 850 rupees per month. Mind, that is the level which is consistent with the poverty line estimates. So basically, even if we have to give a basic income to all people, at the poverty line estimates that will cost around 5% of GDP. Now the idea they are saying ki abolish all subsidies, so that is around 2.5% of GDP. So that means even if I suppose abolish at 2.5% of GDP or make it 50%, that means that the total cost could still come to be significantly, and whether we will be able to fiscally able to achieve it or not. So that my primary point is that at 5% of GDP, even if you remove all the subsidies, whether it is fiscally prudent to go for such an extravagant income transfer policy at this point of time.
And politically prudent as well, right?
Of course. Politically, I think it would not be really feasible right now to withdraw certain subsidies and then go ahead with the UBI. But I think just coming back to what Dr. Joshi said, I think identification is something very, very important. However, the whole underlying theme behind UBI is universalization. And so identification is a problem in the existing scheme of subsidy sets that we provide. But I think when we talk about UBI, then it has to be universal in nature, and hence we get away with the problem of looking for the targeted set of people. And I think that's where the idea of switching from the existing set of schemes of subsidies to a universal basic income is important. So that's where we need to categorize. Yeah.
Reetika, in the survey, they talk about the fact that we can exclude the top 25% of income earners. I don't know if you caught that. What do they mean by that? How are they going to make that judgment? Is it taxpayers or what? What are they talking about?
Yeah, if you exclude the top whatever percent, it does not remain universal basic income. And that has precisely been the problem so far, is identifying the poor identifying the not poor is not an easy exercise in any case, and also people's status keeps changing, right?
Yeah.
So this targeting, once you bring in targeting, then it's not universal basic income. And the other point that quickly I'd like to make is that in the international debate, when people talk about UBI, it is being seen as something that will replace unemployment benefits and programs that are targeted to people who are out of work. So it could be even skill formation programs, right? Nowhere in the world is it being projected as a replacement for every form of subsidy, like not in Finland, not in Switzerland, not in the pilots that are being tried out in Canada and Netherlands. There's nowhere a discussion of removing government expenditure on health, education, sanitation, food security. It's only a replacement of programs for unemployed people. So I think that context is also important to bring into the Indian debate, because it's by the time it's reached India, it's become a completely different idea from what it originally was.
No, absolutely. And I don't know, they haven't mentioned specifically schemes like, say, Narega, Reetika, but one would assume that they would have to do away with something like that as well.
Right. No, so that's another interesting observation. Actually, that's another point of confusion. On the one hand, the chapter is saying that the PDS and Narega, the Employment Guarantee Act, have seen a lot of improvement in implementation, especially in terms of leakages going down.
Okay.
And yet they say that no, now we have to wrap all this up and do something completely new. This is, the way it is being talked about now it's very likely to become another disaster like demonetization, where it will cause a lot of disruption and people are barely able to cope with that. And if you suddenly start proposing removal of other lifeline programs such as Narega and PDS, it's a bit scary to think of what might happen.
Before we move on to the next topic, as people who are looking at the government's finances every day, the three of you in particular, what would be your response if the government actually started an implementation of this? Would it be positive, negative in your view?
Well, I think it depends on the scale, and if they do it in a phased manner, I think then they can phase it out, and it will slowly. But it is going to push the fiscal side pretty badly, and it's also not the central government alone. So they might have to tie hands with the state governments, because state governments will also have to bear. They also give subsidies, and they'll also have to bear part of the burden. So I think these are not easy. It's going to be a little disruptive. To implement it in one go. So it has to. They'll have to do pilots. They'll have to phase it out. And just to add to what Reetika was saying, I think in the Western countries, it essentially this issue arose of universal basic income because the automation was eating into jobs. I mean, they were, I think
But that's going to happen here also. You also put that report out saying
automation
that's
is going to happen, but I think it's not going to happen with at such a pace as it is happening there. But yeah, it's a challenge. I think in addition to automation, the problem we have is that we have a young population which is going to explode. The Western economies have aging population, so I think it's a combination of both. I mean, automation plus the large number of people coming into the workforce who cannot be gainfully employed. All the sectors that employ people, I think they're not growing fast. I mean, the sectors that don't employ people are the ones that are growing faster right now.
The fabulous report you put out just ahead of the budget. What would your headline on your report be if the government announced UBI? You have some great headlines.
Yes, definitely. I think it will have a negative bearing on the fiscal finances for sure. Center plus state together, because here the schemes are going to be phased out in whichever manner they choose to. It will have a bearing on the overall public finances, general government finances. And more importantly, we'll have to see how exactly that happens, because if it is going to happen in a disruptive fashion, it may actually, the problem may magnify here. So clearly it is going to be negative on the fiscals.
Sir, final word.
See, I'll just say two quick things. The first thing is that I think the estimates which have been put out, that is the bare minimum in terms of the poverty line. So for example, at 5% of GDP, that assumes that every person will get around close to the amount of money which is equivalent to just living on the subsistence level. So that means the cost is actually on the lower side. The cost could go higher up. The second thing is that there are some very interesting graphs in the economic survey which shows that some of the programs have been doing very badly. For example, one of them is the midday meal, where you see that the curve is significantly lower than the distribution. Midday meal is one of them. Then the other program is the Nariga program in terms of whether it is going to the poor or not. But some of the schemes like the Prime Minister Awas Yojana is actually doing a little bit better than well. So my sense is that fiscally it is going to be very difficult to implement. And what the government can do, we can look at some of the schemes which are not doing well, try to see whether those schemes could be replaced by some sort of an hybrid scheme of this income transfer. So that is one way looking at the thing.
Just to add here one thing, I think they've also given a nice chart talking about the subsidies which are largely being targeted for the poor and the non-poor. They've segregated that.
Non-merit as they're called.
So I think that also kind of explains that when they are starting the phasing out, they may want to focus on that ratio a lot before they really start taking. But yes,
I think NIPFP is re-looking at those numbers. Ritika, you want to add something before we move on from this?
Yeah, so I'll add a couple of points. These graphs that were just talked about on mistargeting, actually there is a wealth of literature in economics from the World Bank, from research economists at Cornell University, all of which is showing that NREGA is a very well targeted program. Similarly, the midday meal program, there's not that much literature on targeting per se, but there is a lot of literature on all the benefits from the midday meal program in terms of enrollment, attendance, learning outcomes, etc. So this metric that is being used is quite faulty in the economic survey, and one has to understand that that's not the only metric which needs to be used. These are programs that are aimed at different things. Their main aim is not targeting. Their main aim is to ensure that children come to school and don't have to learn on an empty stomach. And this, the other point that you were raising about non-merit subsidies, NIPFP has sent out their latest numbers, and in 2011-12 it was 5% of GDP on non-merit subsidies, and it's likely to have come down to about 3.3%, I think. Okay. So the fiscal space for any decent universal transfer just doesn't exist. Okay. And to gauge programs like NREGA and midday meals on this really, completely new cooked up kind of metric with districts on one axis, poor districts on one axis and percentage of poor on the other, disregarding all the other literature that's pointing at a completely different direction, that I found a little bit odd in the chapter.
Sure. So we'll have to tread with caution. Ritika, I know you have to go. Thank you so much for joining us. Very kind of you to take the time. I'm now going to move to regular stuff that we are all focusing on, fiscal deficit and growth numbers and the demonetization impact. We'll also talk a little bit about bad bank if we can. So fiscal, I was a little confused about the wording in that fiscal chapter. On the one hand, they said that the global scenario doesn't hold true for us. The old fiscal framework is what we should stick to. But then they're also asking for some operational leeway in the FRBM. What do we make of it, sir?
No, I agree with you. In fact, I was also looking at the chapter very closely. and there is a line which the chapter clearly advocates for fiscal prudence. But there is one line over here which says that India has a peculiar tendency of fiscal extravagance in the times of growth, and not so fiscal and counter-cyclical fiscal policy in terms of growth actually taking degrowth. So it is saying that there should be some sort of a fiscal rules. It is not clearly saying whether it could be a counter-cyclical fiscal policy, because India mostly has been following a pro-cyclical fiscal policy if you look into the growth outcome. So it is not talking clearly about the counter-cyclical fiscal policy, but it is still saying that there should be some sort of a fiscal rule. So I think the survey is keeping the options open in case the government is going down on the path of fiscal consolidation in terms of a higher deficit number. So, and the other thing which it has clearly said, which is also was very interesting, which looks a little interesting to me, is that it says that the center should actually learn from the states in terms of the fiscal federalism. But I don't know whether, given the current state of the state finances, I think the center has been doing quite a fine job, even though it has that for the last 2 years, and whether the states have been doing a better job or not. So
you want to comment?
Well, part of the reason why, just taking on what Soumya said, part of the reason center is doing is because it has put in cesses, etc. The benefit only accrues to them. It doesn't get shared with the state. So I think, and then they have gained tremendously from the excise, etc. I think so. These things have excise on oil. So these have kind of helped the central government disproportionately, I would say, and states were the first ones to with zero revenue deficit. I think no central government has not attained that ever. But I think coming back to the fiscal side, I think what so I agree that there is, I think there it's both using both the hands. You can use some fiscal space and you don't have any fiscal space. But one interesting thing that the survey points out is that in the past the governments have relied on growth to reduce the debt to GDP ratio, and that's not a good strategy. And I think they should focus on the primary deficit part of it, which is, I think, from a debt dynamics perspective, which primary deficit is after taking the interest payments out. So I think that is the current fiscal stance of the government, and we should focus on that. So the debate seems to be back on the debt levels, because despite fiscal consolidation, debt to GDP hasn't come down.
It has come down from what, mid-70s to
about 66. Yeah,
that
is true. But in the last 4 years, it is stable. And it's actually gone up. I mean, if you take the center and states up together.
Okay. So what would that? Sorry.
I think I would draw the inference from entire fiscal chapter. Largely, I think they seemed very, very much concerned about the state's finances a lot. I mean,
but that was also weird, right? On the one hand, they praise the states, then they say that there could be some pressure. So I think
they try to balance it off for both the center and the states. By one side saying that yes, there is probably one should practice fiscal prudence, but at the same time saying that if you slip, because demonetization requires fiscal tools to support policy support. That's exactly the statement they've used, that because of demonetization, you need policy support. So somewhere they are trying to suggest that we need to, or there is some kind of a leeway we should use to slip from the 3%, but maybe still be lower than 3.5% at the center's fiscal deficit. So that's exactly what markets are going with. You know, markets are kind of looking at a 3.2 to 3.4% range clearly. So consolidation is happening at the center's level from 3.5% to say a 3.3% or so. But the question here is whether center plus state together, are we really consolidating? And that's where the worry is. And I think the ECO survey has somewhere highlighted those concerns by focusing a lot on the state, by suggesting that states should be really, looking at their finances more prudently. Of course, I mean, you cannot completely blame them because the Uday-related problems have, they've been burdened with the Uday-related payouts. They've been burdened with, of course, the petroleum prices that had fallen. So as a result of which, stamp duty, collections, they had fallen. Yeah. So of course, there have been issues. But the fact is, the finances of the states are not in good shape, and that's what the survey does highlight clearly.
Yeah. Will we get a 3% number tomorrow?
Well, I think there is a fair chance. I think depending on how much money additional money that government gets out of this demonetization, etc. But I think maybe it's not the right time to target exactly 3%. I mean, as long as you target below 3.5, you are still on the fiscal consolidation path.
You'll be comfortable if you get 3.2 or 3.3. Market will be comfortable. I know. I think market seems to have built in 3.2, 3.3.
I think I have a sneaky feeling that tomorrow, I don't know, this is a guess. Basically, I think the government is going to lose 3 months of revenue because of the GST. So, and there is also a talk of moving to the January to December quarter.
If that
so
happens, I don't know how anybody is going to analyze
so
any
April
number.
to December could be, they could actually go from April to December this year, and next year they could from January to December. So that will solve most of the problems without anyone of us knowing what will be the exact impact. But coming back to the 3%, I think that the government had delivered 4.1% when the market was convinced of a 4.4%. So there is an earlier precedence of that. So I will not completely rule out 3%. But I agree with Joshi that at this point of time, we should not be overtly constrained by a 3% factor, 3% fiscal deficit target.
Which brings me to demonetization in some way. If they were to take the fiscal room, where are they going to spend it? Are they going to spend it on demonetization related, impact on the consumer sector, or are they going to stick to capex as the place that needs to be pushed? Any of you can take that.
If I may take that.
Yeah.
My sense is I think you have limited resources, and the budgeting is all about using them prudently. And at this juncture, it's not only about raising consumption, it's also equally about generating employment. I think employment, as I was pointing out, has suffered. So now there are some sectors where if you focus on, have high labor intensity. Construction is clearly one of them, highest labor intensity. And it employs the lower class of workers. I mean, it's very labor intensive in India. So if you focus on road and on the low cost housing, I'm not talking of the high cost housing, which are anyway, I think they're overburdened with too much inventory. So if you focus on these two elements, you will not only generate employment, you will also push consumption, because this category of people have high propensity to consume. And this discretionary spending in this category is around 24% of the total consumption expenditure. So I think it will be positive for people who have suffered, because construction workers are the ones who construction activity stopped, then they went back. So I think maybe focus spending on for boosting consumption, which creates assets and which is not just mere giveaway. I think that would be a prudent policy.
My point also was that if you look at the GDP growth estimates for next year, it's 6.75 to 7.5, right? In any case, this year pre-demonetization, we were talking about 7.1. So in that sense, there's no real need for stimulus to the economy. Nobody is saying that growth is going to crash to 6% and hence needs to be pushed up through some sort of consumption stimulus. So I mean, so then is the argument for fiscal expansion still there, is more my point.
I think somewhere we are not really accepting that the 1 or 2 quarters are lost because of demonetization. We have a very patchy mix of data that is not clearly suggesting how demonetization has really affected. We don't have, it's only anecdotally that we are getting instances here and there. The real problem, which if the cash crunch continues even for a month or 2 more, is something wherein the rural sector is definitely getting affected for sure. Now, if you go back to the last couple of years, investment has been the missing link in a growth cycle. In any case, it is the consumption which has been holding up growth. And if the backbone, which has been there in the last 4-5 years, that kind of breaks, then definitely we see a structural downward shift to GDP. Okay. So somewhere I think there will be a need to support consumption as well, while I definitely agree that investment or construction linked activities should be also promoted, because the employment generation and hence its implications on consumption is going to be very important.
What did you make of the numbers themselves, their estimates and the way they have calculated the impact of demonetization? Any thoughts on that, sir?
No, I think the estimates of which 6.7 to 7.5% next year actually means that the impact of the demonetization could actually be prolonged than what we have been anticipating, because this year we have end up with a growth rate around 7% or so, assuming that the numbers remain the same. So next year the target is 6.7 to 7.5. So we are at the same level of growth rate. So in that sense, the Economist service is admitting that the impact of demonetization could be a little more prolonged than what we are anticipating. That is first point. The second thing is that regarding the also there is a discrepancy in, they are saying they are not confident with the CSO nominal GDP numbers. They have clearly said that the Economist Service said their nominal GDP estimates for FY17 is actually 11.25%.
Yeah.
So that means, and that should be taken as a downside to the growth estimates. They are talking about the nominal number and the real number. Yeah. So that's the one thing. The second thing, as DK was pointing out, also in terms of the consumption related boom, I think that yes, investment requires an facelift, but as of now, given the state of the leverage of the players, I am not too convinced about when this private sector investment activity is going to go up. And the government has been pushing public investment significantly in the last 1 or 2 years, and there is a limit to that fiscal space. So I think at the end of the day, it all boils down to giving some sort of consumption shocks to, for example, the salaried class. And we have seen that in FY 2014, when we had actually increased those limits of the section 80C, for example, by 50,000, there was a large percentile of the saving class which actually shifted from 1 lakh to 1.5 lakh. So I think some sort of saving incentives could be the way forward. And my sense is that some investment incentives could be given, but that is not going to work significantly in the next couple of months, and a consumption boost should be the priority of the government and the need of the hour.
Speaking of this investment, and I recognize that none of you are banking sector, experts, but still in the context of the broader economy, they've talked about a bad bank, a public sector bad bank, and I think if you read that entire section, it's all in the context of the fact that we've had 8 years where we've been stuck with this problem. We have tried pretty much everything. The Reserve Bank has come out with scheme after scheme. Nothing is working. So we need a centralized solution to do away with this problem and then spur investment. In theory, sir, would you buy into that argument?
Well, I think it's a hotly debated area, and I think there's no consensus on that. And I think it worked in certain countries. It worked in US. I mean, the bad bank idea, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it will work here. I think I haven't looked very deeply into this into this area, so I would restrict my comments to saying that I think there are other, the problems in the banking sector, I think, requires other resolutions as well. I mean, it's not just getting rid of the NPAs. I mean, what happens to the Indradhanush program? I mean, so how much of that has been implemented? Yeah. I think those things are also critical. I mean, because eventually they will ensure that you are on the right track. And I think the quickest solution would be for government to capitalize it, but that I think that requires fiscal room. So yeah. I would just hold on to that comment. I mean, sure. I haven't looked at it that deeply.
No, that's perfectly fair. But interestingly, in the survey, they want to de-link the capital issue from the stressed assets issue. It seems a little silly. I mean, how can you de-link the two? If you had enough capital, you would provision against it, and things would be fine. Well, Upasna?
I would reserve my comments on this really, but overall, I think recapitalization would probably solve some parts of the problem. I think in the survey they've again re-emphasized, like last year, on RBI helping them out with the fact that
use RBI's reserves.
Yes, so RBI's capital reserves are around 30% of the balance sheet, which is significantly higher than many of our peers if we were to compare. And they've tried to use that argument, saying that maybe we can use part of that surplus capital to recapitalize the banks. Of course, there are pros and cons of this deployment of capital, of course. But even for a bad bank, there will have to be somewhere a backing, which at the moment we don't have any room for. We don't have resources to really provide or fund that kind of a bad bank. So I'm not sure how that would work, in terms of its logistics, in terms of its entire setup. I'm not really clear. So that's why whether in case of India it will be a great idea, difficult to say. Yeah.
Sir, but hypothetically, if it's done and if these stressed assets are taken out of the functioning banking system, do you think that was the problem that will then spur investment, or the problem was different, that your capacity utilization levels are just around 70-72%, right? Till you get to about 80% capacity utilization, why would you invest?
No, I agree with your point. I think if I assume that the bad bank is implemented today, I think that is not going to solve the problem, because as of now there is not sufficient demand in the system. So even if you say, for example, transfer the entire assets of all this public sector and private banks and all the entire banking system to an entity, it is unlikely to solve the problem, because if you look into the cycles, any cycle of this asset cycle, when the last time it started, if you remember in 97-98 we had the Narasimhan committee report, ultimately in 2004-05 the bank started to do well. When the gross NPA ratio was around 18-17%, it came down to below 3%. Yeah. So the cycle actually ran 7 to 8 years. This cycle started in 2011. Today we are in 2017. So I still believe there is another 1 to 2 years when this cycle should actually run. And if the bad bank was to be done, it should have been done earlier, at the beginning of the cycle, rather than looking towards the end of the cycle. And I believe that yes, it's a very good idea, but in India as of now you have too many institutions, so I don't know whether this institution is going to solve the problem in one go at this point.
Okay, just last word. Budget priorities for the big budget on Wednesday. Mr. Joshi, is it jobs? Is it?
Well, I think it has to be a it has to be a blend of something which creates jobs and also gives boost to consumption, because job loss is also one of the, and particularly in the informal sector, which is again linked to construction, etc. I think that's a big hit, and the small and medium enterprise have also been hit, and I think they might get further hit because of implementation of GST. At least short-term disruption they might suffer. So I think there is need to support that kind of activity.
Upasna?
Yeah, I would second Dr. Joshi's. I think consumption boost has to come. Agriculture should be given some kind of sops here because they were the most hit in terms of their cash dependency. SMEs for sure. So I think all of this would be required to provide a consumption stimulus in the economy. And at the same time, I think Digital India, I mean, we all know. So, you know, the Make in India and the Digital India, both of these projects will probably get a further boost in the current budget.
Your wish list, and also one thing they should stay away from.
Yeah, I think the first thing I think there should be some consumption related soaps in the budget tomorrow, some things related to digitization, and I think that there should be some renewed focus on the agriculture and the MSME sectors, because these sectors have not done well in the last 1 or 2 years, and they are the creator of their job creation, and so, and basically sector specific incentives. And for the manufacturing sector, some of the incentives in the labor intensive, like the textile sector, the apparel sector, and all these sectors. And regarding the what they should actually stick to, I think they should continue on the path of fiscal consolidation, even if it means that the number we could differ on whether it is 3.2, 3.3, 3.4, but at the end of the day, the path should be maintained, so as to give a message that we are firmly on the course of fiscal prudence, but we had embarked 2 years back.
All right, that seems to be a point of consensus. Stick with fiscal consolidation, take a little bit of room maybe to try and boost consumption in some of the labor intensive sectors. That's our analysis of the economic survey. Keep following the story, both the economic survey and the budget on BloombergQuint.com. Thanks for watching.